Hello, my name is Stephen O'Reilly, and this is Roma Locuta Est Considers. This is a production of RomaLocutaEst.com. And what is RomaLocutaEst.com? You may well ask yourself. Well, it's a wee humble blog that the world little notes, nor will it long remember, but it is devoted to apologetics and commentary on Catholic topics, current events, and general Christian apologetics. We do not seek, we do not accept donations. No funding is received from any source. We're beholden to no one, and we alone are responsible for the content. This is episode 14 of Roma Locuta Est Considers, and today we continue our look at Benepapism and specifically Ganswein's speech. This is actually part 2 of a two-part series, and today we'll conclude our analysis of the speech and the Benepapist claims regarding it. Okay, as in part 1 of this two-part series on Ganswein's speech, my commentary assumes the viewer already has some familiarity with the speech and the whole controversy surrounding it, so I won't be reading long segments from it. That would just make this video far much longer than it might already turn out to be. So what I will do is provide at least an example of a key passage that I think brings forth a lot of the claims that the Benepapists make about Ganswein's speech. After that, I'll lay out one of the Benepapist objections to the validity of Benedict's resignation based on the speech. After that, I'll look at some of Benedict's words from the time of his resignation, the Declaratio, and his last audience, in order to set the stage as to what Benedict actually believed he was doing with regard to his resignation and with regard to being a Pope Emeritus. Having established this context, I will demonstrate that the Ganswein's speech is perfectly consistent with the view that Benedict's resignation was valid. Okay, so like I said, I'm not going to read the whole speech and make this video too long, but I did want to give an example, I think, of what is clearly a section that the Benepapists think is important to their claim that Benedict did not resign the papacy fully, or that he only partially resigned it. There are Benepapists who say that he didn't resign it at all, but I think they all would agree on this passage as being important to their claim. So I won't read through it all, but I highlighted some key phrases, but I'll start up here at the top. So this is Ganswein speaking. The momentous resignation of the theologian Pope represented a step forward, primarily by the fact that on February 11th, 2013, speaking in Latin in front of the surprised cardinals, he introduced into the Catholic Church the new institution of Pope Emeritus, stating that his strength was no longer sufficient to exercise the Petrine ministry. The key word in that statement is munus Petrinum, translated, as happens most of the time, with Petrine ministry. And yet, munus in Latin has a multiplicity of meanings. It can mean serve, duty, guide, gift, or even prodigy. And then that's where we get to our highlighted portion here. This is a key phrase that the Benepapists dwell on. Benedict says, before and after his resignation, Benedict understood and understands his task as participation in such a Petrine ministry. So I guess so you put your mind to that of a Benepapist. They're saying, okay, Ganswein speaking of Petrine ministry, and he's saying here that before and after his resignation, Benedict still views his task as being participation in that Petrine ministry. Then Ganswein continues, he has left the papal throne, and yet, with the step made on February 11th, 2013, he has not at all abandoned this ministry. Instead, he has complemented this personal office with a collegial and a synodal dimension as a quasi-shared ministry as though by this he wanted to reiterate once again the invitation contained in the motto. There's no need to go through the rest of that. I'll actually get to it, actually, in my reply, some of the other bit. And then later on, also, the Benepapists will point to this down here where Benedict says, or Ganswein says, since the election of his successor, Francis, on March 13th, 2013, there are not therefore two popes, but de facto an expanded ministry with an active member and a contemplative member. So kind of looking at all these phrases in terms together, you get the Benepapists are saying that here Ganswein is communicating that Benedict somehow kept or only partially resigned the papacy. He maintained part of it. And so now with the election of Francis in 2013, there's now kind of like this active Pope Francis and kind of a contemplative Pope Benedict. This is kind of a synodal papacy or a diarchy, papal diarchy, two popes at the same time almost, kind of, sort of. Of course, this cannot happen. It's impossible in terms of papal doctrine, and that's the point that the Benepapists will say, but that's an error that Benedict is making, trying to do this, what they just claim from this interpretation, because he really can't do that. Even though he believed he could do it, he couldn't, so he was in substantial error, which is from, I think that's a term used in Canon 188, and a resignation in substantial error is, or that contains substantial error is therefore invalid. So that's looping back now to the invalidity of Benedict's resignation. So again, so these are kind of the key terms to kind of look out for, and I'll get to here in my rebuttal. Okay, so based on what we just read through, this would be the type of objection that the Benepapists might make with regard to the validity of Benedict's resignation based on Ganswein's speech. They would say Ganswein speaks of a now expanded ministry of which Benedict is the contemplative member. We just saw some of that wording. He says Pope Francis and Benedict represented one expanded Petrine office with an active member and a contemplative one. Indeed, Ganswein says since February 11th, 2013, the papal ministry is not the same as before. This certainly means, for the Benepapists, means that Ganswein must have recognized Benedict attempted to change the papacy into a synodal one, or into a diarchy. Indeed, Ganswein underlines this by speaking of Benedict's participation in such a Petrine ministry. Therefore, Ganswein, as a close confidant of Benedict and familiar with his thought, this speech demonstrates that Benedict still considered himself Pope in some real way. So that would be the objection, I think a fair presentation of what the kind of general objection would be made by a Benepapist. Okay, having seen part of the speech and read the objection of the Benepapists, let's go straight to the heart of the question. At first glance, it does seem odd to pious ears to read that Archbishop Ganswein said that Pope Francis and Pope Emeritus Benedict together somehow comprised an expanded ministry. The question, of course, is, did Ganswein really mean to suggest that there was then, at that time, an official, legal, or structurally expanded papacy in reality, that there was, in fact, and was in law, in Benedict's mind, an expanded papacy, that Benedict was still papal in some real way? To this question, we know the answer given by the Benepapists. They demand we interpret Ganswein in a very strict sense, a sense that is consistent with the alleged substantial error necessary to overturn the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. The Benepapists will allow no other explanation, They won't search for another explanation. One must be a liar or have some financial interest to suggest otherwise, as one of them suggested. And we saw that in part one. That was one of the objections that Anne Barnhart had levied, that you have to essentially read the Ganswein speech her way, and if you don't, that somehow you're fundamentally dishonest or you're a liar. However, as I will argue, reading the whole of Ganswein's speech in context and remembering the context, it is clear he is not speaking of a really expanded ministry in the strict sense as interpreted by the Benepapists. Rather, I will hope to show, and I believe I do, rather he is speaking in a looser, extended, even a figurative sense about an expanded ministry. He's not talking about some change to the structure of the papacy. He's not talking about that at all. But before we get to that, I wanted to take a quick look at what Benedict said himself in the Declaratio and in the last audience about what he intended about his post-resignation life. So let's take a quick look first at Declaratio and then the last audience. Okay, so this is the Declaratio. This is the instrument of Benedict's resignation that he read at a consistory of cardinals on February 11th. I won't go through the whole thing. I really wanted to focus on what his intentions were for after his resignation. But let's pick it up at the most key part of the Declaratio, which affects his resignation. This is really, if he had only one sentence to include in this document, or all he needed for this document to resign, is this sentence. So he above here he outlines what his reasons were for resigning, and then he states in concert with Canon 332.2, he says, and well aware of the seriousness of this act, and with full freedom, I declare that I renounce the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, entrusted to me by the cardinals on 19 April 2005. I resign it in such a way that as from February 28, 2013 at 8 o'clock, the See of Rome, the See of Peter, will be vacant, and a conclave to elect the new Supreme Pontiff will have to be convoked by those whose competence it is. So, we've talked about in other videos in this series on Benepapism about this section, but I think it's pretty evident that it is clear here that he did resign. He said the See of Rome would be vacant. He's resigning the ministry in such a way that the See of Rome, the See of Peter, is vacant. If it's vacant, there's no Pope. We don't even have to get into discussion about the Latin that he used. I know, and again, I talked about that in the first 5 episodes of this series about that as well. But so there's no need to get into it again here. But I think it's clear that his intent here is to vacate the See of Rome, the See of Peter, and he's saying a new conclave has to be held now. Why? Because they're going to need a new Supreme Pontiff. Why do you need a new one? Because the old one is gone. Okay, so here he's saying, I'm out of here as of February 28th. And then he goes on in his Declaratio, as someone who's leaving would do, say thank you to those who work with him. So he says to the cardinals who are present, dear brothers, I thank you most sincerely for all the love and work with which you have supported me in my ministry, and I ask pardon for all my defects. So obviously he's saying goodbye. And now that I'm saying goodbye and will be gone, let us entrust the Holy Church to the care of our Supreme Pastor, our Lord Jesus Christ, and implore His Holy Mother so that she may assist the Cardinal Fathers with her maternal solicitude in electing a new Supreme Pontiff. Again, the new Supreme Pontiff. So he's saying kind of goodbye, so let's pray to the Lord and to Mary that she may assist the cardinals in a conclave to elect a new pontiff. And then So that's kind of like all in the past now. I'm saying thank you, goodbye. Let's pray for a new pope. And then he adds what he's going to do now with the rest of his life. He says, with regard to myself, I wish also to devotedly serve the Holy Church of God in the future through a life dedicated to prayer. So here he's putting front and center that as Pope Emeritus, that he's going to dedicate his life to prayer. I think that's key to remember as we get to Ganswein's speech and understanding what's going on here. Okay, so here I want to read a little bit from the Benedict's last audience, and this is in the middle of it, his last audience, and it's the part where he talks about the always is also a forever. The Benepapists want to say that this reference to the always is forever, by that reference, Benedict is saying that he somehow retains the Petrine Munus, that he is somehow indelibly marked with the mark of the papacy, as if, it's like a priestly ordination, and that he has his mark on his soul, and that he can't lose it, that he's Pope always and forever, that he's always going to be Pope, and this feeds into their theory that either he believed he was resigning the papacy partially, or that in the case of Cianci and Estefania Acosta, that maybe he believed he was really remaining Pope completely. But let's see, that is not borne out. So I want to look at this section here, these two paragraphs, for a couple things. One, just to revisit the always and always is also a forever line to show why the Benepapists are wrong, because I think it helps set up an understanding of what's going on in Ganswein's speech, but also here it explains what he intends to do with his life after his resignation. Again, that feeds into the Ganswein speech to properly understand it. But because the Benepapists have misread this document, the last audience, because they misread that, that's why they're off at understanding what's going on with Ganswein's speech. So let's pick it up here. So in parts 8 and 9, episodes 8 and 9, I go through in great detail Ganswein's speech, the whole thing, the kind of showing what his thought is throughout and following his logic. And I think it's important for those who are hung up on it to maybe go back to my episodes 8 and 9, or read some of my articles on the last audience, or even get my book, a shameless plug there. But here we are. We'll pick up the narrative here at the very top. So here, this is Benedict speaking. Here, allow me to go back once again to 19 April 2005. That's when he was elected. The real gravity of the decision, and here the gravity of the decision he's talking about is his decision to resign. The gravity of that decision was also due to the fact that from the moment on, I was engaged always and forever by the Lord. So something about being engaged by the Lord always and forever made his decision kind of grave for him, something that he had to kind of really ponder. There's something about being engaged always and forever by the Lord that impacted him. And, maybe it was an obstacle for him, or some hurdle he had to get over, something grave. So the key is, what does he mean? How does he mean I was always and forever engaged by the Lord? Well, Benedict tells us. Benedict defines his terms. He says here, always, anyone who accepts the Petrine ministry no longer has any privacy. That is how Benedict is defining his always. He's not defining it with reference to the munus or some indelible mark or retaining the papacy in any way. He's defining it in terms of the loss of privacy. Okay, so what does he mean by that? What's this loss of privacy? Benedict continues. He, someone who's elected pope, he belongs always and completely to everyone, to the whole church. In a manner of speaking, the private dimension of his life is completely eliminated. So you become pope, you no longer just stay, I can travel about, do what I want or whatever, and you now belong to other people. And again, he develops his thought more here. So let's continue here. I was able to experience, and I experience it even now, that one receives one's life precisely when one gives it away. So he's given away his privacy, but he's given away that life, and he's gotten back a new life. Earlier, I said that many people who love the Lord also love the successor of St. Peter and feel a great affection for him, and that the Pope truly has brothers and sisters, sons and daughters throughout the world, and that he feels secure in the embrace of your communion because he no longer belongs to himself. He belongs to all, and all belong to him. So that's the loss of privacy. I'm elected, I'm a pope, or whoever becomes elected as pope. He belongs to the church, not as an abstraction, certainly as an abstraction too, but that abstraction is we're talking about individual people. He's talking here about sons and daughters, brothers and sisters throughout the world. So he's talking about this in a very personalistic way. So he's taking this to heart. He's like, hey, you over there, you're my brother, you're my daughter, my son or daughter, and you belong to me and I belong to you. So he's talking about a bond of charity with the individuals who comprise the church. So it's a very beautiful thought that's kind of been butchered by the Benepapists, who kind of leave all this out in their representations of the last audience. So that's what he's talking about. When you become pope, or I became pope, I lost my privacy, but I gained this new life of belonging to other people, and they to me. I have this bond of charity, this bond of love with others, this spiritual link. So what happens, though? He goes on now to explain what's going to happen now that he has resigned, or will be resigning the next day when his resignation becomes effective. He goes on to say here, the always is also forever. There can be no longer a return to the private sphere. My decision to resign the active ministry does not revoke this. Now, he's saying that he's talking still about the private sphere here. He says that the always is also forever. There can be no return to the private sphere. He said, I'm not going back. I had this bond of charity with all of you. I can't go back to my life before. In fact, he says it right here. I do not return to the private life, to a life of travel, meetings, receptions, conferences, and so on. I can't go back to that kind of love. I have this bond of affection for you guys. Even though I'm leaving the papacy, resigning does not revoke this. And please see my episodes 8 and 9, where I show grammatically and logically the revoke this has to refer back to the privacy. It does not refer to the moonists or anything like that. The Benepapists are clearly misreading this, and I defy them to show where I'm wrong on this. But they won't address the articles or the videos or my book on this point. They'll just keep on going on, saying it has to do with the moonists, or this indelible mark, or his intent to retain the papacy. But it clearly, if you're following this here, you see that it does not do any of those things. He is referring to a loss of privacy, and he explains what that is. And in fact, I show in episodes 8 or 9 that he spoke about Pope Paul VI while as Cardinal Ratzinger, still in a homily after the death of Paul VI. He makes the same idea as in there about the loss of privacy, about no longer belonging, a pope no longer be able to belong to himself once he's elected. So again, that's the theme that he's talking about here. So he's saying I can't go back. I'm not going to be traveling and kind of being cardinal giving speeches somewhere and that type of stuff. But at the same time, he's saying, but I'm not abandoning the cross, but remaining in a new way at the side of the crucified Lord. So he's remaining in a manner of speaking by the side of the Lord, but in a new way, not as Pope, as an ex-Pope. And he says that here, I no longer bear the power of office for the governance of the church. So he's saying, I'm not going to be Pope anymore. I don't bear the power of governance. But in the service of prayer, I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter, and that's staying in the Vatican, where he ended up staying at the little monastery. There is where he stayed in the service of prayer. That's what he had said in the Declaratio, which we just read in the last slide, about how he's going to devote his life to prayer. And he goes on here. Saint Benedict, whose name I bear as Pope, will be a great example for me in this. He showed us the way for a life, which, whether active or passive, is completely given over to the work of God. So again, he's talking about a life. So earlier in this section here, we talked about my decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this. This referred to privacy. The Benepapists like to say, he said active exercise. But what he's doing in this paragraph is contrasting an active life versus the passive life, where he just showed us here that he's going to now devote his life to prayer. And the example of Saint Benedict, which I just read, Saint Benedict showed us the way for a life, not for an office, not for the papacy. He showed us the way for a life, which, active or passive, active being a priest, a pope, a professor, or whatever, or passive being someone who's contemplative and in prayer, is completely given over to the work of God. So he said here that he has this bond of charity. He's maintaining this love for all. He's not walking away from that. I still love you guys. I'm not going to go back to kind of my old private life because I can't. I have this spiritual link with you now. I have this moral responsibility to you that I feel. So I'm going to continue to pray for you, pray for the church, my sons and daughters. That is the point of what he's saying here in the last audience. And I think that's important to keep this front and center as we try to understand what Ganswein is saying, because there really isn't any disagreement between Ganswein and Benedict on these points. Okay, so again, I just want to make sure this point is driven home about the Always is Also Forever. Please check out episodes 8 and 9 where I talk about in detail the Always is Also Forever. It's also a whole chapter in my book, a shameless plug there, or you can find it in my free articles on my blog. Excuse me. But I think it's important to show Benedict's logic regarding the Always and Forever refers to privacy. It does not refer to the munus. It does not refer to an indelible mark of the papacy. It does not refer to somehow keeping the papacy in some way after his resignation. We just looked at it in detail, how Benedict's logic regarding the Always is Also Forever refers to the loss of a private life. So I just wanted to, let's just kind of just summarize again what he's saying in the last audience relative to Always is Also Forever, because again, that's important to keep front and center as we approach Ganswein's speech. Benedict says, one who is elected Pope belongs to the Church and the Church to him. The private dimension of his life, in a manner of speaking, is lost. Yet, one receives one's life when one gives it away. The Pope truly gains brothers and sisters, sons and daughters throughout the world. In other words, the Pope becomes a father. A Pope feels secure in the Church's embrace because he no longer belongs to himself. He belongs to all, and all belong to him. This is the Always. It's in his homily, the last audience, which we just went through. I showed you the text, showed you how he talks about the gravity of the decision, the gravity which impacted, probably made him hesitant about resigning, was this feeling that this Always is Also Forever, that I have this love, this bond of belonging to the Church, I to they and they to me, and that was something difficult for him because he had this bond of love, this sense of moral responsibility. But he, again, as he said in his declaratio, but still one has to have strength of body and mind to be a pope or to do the things that a pope needs to do, and for that reason, that's why he was leaving. But he still holds this love for everybody. So that's why he goes on to say, but this Always is Also Forever, in that resigning the papacy, it does not revoke the bond of charity. So he's saying, yeah, I'm resigning, but I still love you guys. So this loss of privacy, this loving attachment, which has been gained by the loss of the private life, the private dimension of one's life. So that resigning the papacy will not revoke his love for his sons and daughters, the church. And again, he's talking about this at a very personalistic level, not just loving the church, belonging to the church as some abstraction. He's talking about viewing it as, individual people, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, or whatever, that he has this loving attachment, and that resigning does not revoke that love. That's the this. It does not revoke this. I showed in episodes 8 and 9 how that grammatically and logically the this refers to that. I mean, that's what it does in the text. It refers back to the loss of privacy. So it does not, the this is not referring back to the munus or an indelible mark or anything like that at all. That's the papists have gone off the rails on that. Thus, even after his resignation, he will retain this love. So he's retaining this love. It doesn't revoke, the resignation doesn't revoke his love for the church, for you and me, his sons and daughters. So just as a father would for his sons, he will continue to pray in service for his sons and daughters, the church. So he becomes pope. He gains sons and daughters. He lost his private life, but he's also gained sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. He has this bond of charity. Even though he's resigning, the resignation doesn't revoke this bond of love for his sons and daughters. But because he has this bond, he feels this moral responsibility. They just can't kind of go back to a life of just only being a guy who writes papers, goes on speeches, goes on trips, gives speeches and all that. No, he wants, because he feels this spiritual link, this moral responsibility to his sons and daughters, he's going to continue on in the service of the church through prayer. So he's going to pray for us. That's what he can do for us. He's too weak to be pope for us anymore, so he's going to resign. But now, because he retains that bond of love, he's going to devote the rest of his life, or devoted the rest of his life, to prayer for the church. So that's what he had said in the Declaratio. He's going to devote his life to prayer. That's what he said in the last audience. And again, it's important to keep that front and center as we now get into more directly Ganswein's speech, because we're going to see that there is no real conflict between the two talks, Benedict's or Ganswein's. So let's move on to that. Okay, now all that as background, let's get into replying directly to the objection, but let's just quickly first restate the objection. I gave a longer version of this, but here, just a summary version of the objection. Ganswein spoke of an expanded Petrine ministry, a quasi-shared ministry with a synodal dimension. I think he even mentioned a collegial dimension. This can only mean, say the Benepapists, that Benedict believed he was still pope in some real way. Some Benepapists will say that Benedict believed this in a partial way, that he somehow resigned partially, or that he was creating, or thought he was creating, a papal diarchy, or something to that effect, but that somehow he still bore within him an indelible mark of being pope, and that he believed that he could not undo that. Or there are those who kind of follow the idea of the Ratzinger Code, like Andrea Cianci, which I did a 3-part series on the Ratzinger Code, so I point you guys to that. I won't get all into that here, but the Ratzinger Code folks will say, such as Andrea Cianci or Estefania Acosta, that Benedict intended to keep the papacy, that maybe he created a self-impeded see, but that he was still pope in the real sense of the word. Okay, with all that said, let's get to my reply to objection 4. First, I'd say that certainly Ganswein does speak of Benedict participating in an expanded Petrine ministry and all those other things that we talked about or quoted from Ganswein. Clearly, he said those things. So what of this? What of the synodal dimension, or a collegial dimension, or this expanded Petrine ministry? What does that all mean? To approach this, I'd first start off saying, hey, let's start with a question the Benepapists never have seemed to consider. And that question is, must these references to an expanded Petrine ministry, to a collegial dimension and synodal dimension and so forth, must these texts, these references, must they be interpreted in a strict sense as the Benepapists demand? Is that required? Is that required from the text itself? Or does it make more sense to interpret them in a looser, more figurative sense? So the question, I think, is, did Ganswein mean these references to a quasi-shared ministry or or expanded Petrine ministry in synodal and collegial dimensions? Did he mean these in a strict, theologically technical sense, meaning Benedict was still Pope in some way? Or does it make more sense to consider that he meant this in a looser, extended, or a more figurative sense? You see the Benepapists arguing the first part, that there has to be a strict sense, but they don't provide a case why Ganswein's references can't mean something less offensive. Why it could have been meant in a figurative or an extended sense, and we'll get into that here shortly. But you never see him rule out why competing theories are wrong in order to demonstrate their theory is right. That it can't be this thing, Steve, therefore it's this thing over here. I've never seen them say that no, any looser reading of the texts or figurative reading of his text is excluded. That I've never seen them argue that. And in fact, I'd say this latter sense that I'm suggesting, that maybe we should, is there a way of reading Ganswein? Is it conceivable? Is it possible? Is it justified? Can we fairly read from his text that he's really meaning some of these phrases, these problematic phrases like expanded Petrine ministry or synodal dimension and collegial dimension and so forth? Is it possible they're less offensive than what the Benepapists suggest, that they're not as controversial, that he didn't mean them in that sense? And I think, and I'm confident as we go forward here, this latter sense that I'm suggesting, that he meant it more in an extended, looser, or maybe even say figurative sense, that's I think clearly suggested by a reading of the text itself. So we're not going to impose this interpretation from the outside. I want to see if the text itself supports that idea, that the literal hard reading of the Benepapists, the very narrow reading of theirs that say, no, you have to read it to mean that he meant that Benedict really had partially resigned the papacy, or meant to partially resign the papacy. That's what Ganswein said. That's how they want to read it. But is there reasons in the text itself to say, hey, the Benepapists are wrong in trying to look at this text so strictly, that it was meant in an extended sense, looser sense, figurative sense, let's just say that. And I think that is the case, and I'm going to argue that here as we go forward. So keep that in mind. And we've already talked about the senses of what Benedict meant when we looked at the Declaratio, and then we looked at the last audience. So you have that in mind. He had this idea of living out the rest of his life in prayer. So with that again in the forefront, let's go on here, and we're going to look at the text directly that we start off this presentation with from the Ganswein speech, and I'm going to show why a looser sense of these terms should be preferred to what the Benepapists are suggesting. Okay, so we're returning here to the text from the Ganswein speech that we looked at earlier, and I had highlighted at that time several key phrases or terms that are problematic, at least for the Benepapists. So, for example, and which I will address here and kind of explain why I don't see it that way, why I think they're wrong. For one, they talk about again, this is Ganswein's words here. I'm not going to read through the whole text, just some of the highlighted things. These are things that I will get to in the course of my reply to objection 4. The Benepapists point out that Ganswein says the key word in the statement, and that's the Benedict's resignation. The key word in the Declaratio used is munus petrinum, and translated as happens most of the time with petrine ministry. And yet munus in Latin has a multiplicity of meanings. It can mean serve. It can mean serve, duty, guide, or gift, or even prodigy. And then another phrase that's problematic for them is before and after his resignation, Benedict understood and understands. So he continued to understand, even after his resignation, his task as a participation in such a Petrine ministry. And then later on, it goes to say that there's a collegial and synodal dimension to it. It's a quasi-shared ministry. And then later on, he talks about a de facto, he calls it a de facto and expanded ministry with an active member and a contemplative member. All right, so we're going to look at this section, and I will address it. I think what we'll see is reading the whole of Ganswein's speech in context. Again, we're only taking a part here, but I think I can show even in this clip, why the Benepapists are wrong. But reading the whole of Ganswein's speech, or even this section in context, both the context of what Ganswein said, but also what Benedict had said before him 3 years before, that will be clear that Ganswein is not speaking of an expanded ministry in a strict sense as interpreted by the Benepapists. He's not speaking of him literally being Pope still sharing in the papal, being within the papal ministry, not in the sense that he's Pope. Rather, as I'll argue, is that he's speaking in a looser, extended sense. You want to call it metaphorical or figurative. I don't know what the right word to use, but he's not speaking in the strict theological sense that the Benepapists would like us to say. So anyway, so let's go through this section, and I will explain why I believe the Benepapists are definitely wrong. Okay, so here I'm going to get into a variety of reasons why we should believe that Ganswein speaking in a looser sense of when he speaks of Petrine ministry here, or expanded Petrine ministry, or collegial dimension, all that he's speaking in a loose sense, not in a strict sense that Benedict is still Pope in some way, that he's speaking kind of in a looser sense. So let's pick up the narrative again. This is we'd seen this paragraph, or these set of paragraphs earlier in this video, and I highlighted some of the key areas, and I want to get to all of them here to kind of show to the Benepapists out there why I think you really should reconsider your use of this text and reconsider Benepapism in toto because of this. Anyway, so Ganswein says, beginning up here, and we're going to read down at this part. We're going to read down to right about down here. So that's what we'll talk about here before I go through the rest of the paragraph and some other slides. Anyway, Ganswein speaking says, the momentous resignation of the theologian Pope represented a step forward, primarily by the fact that on February 11th, 2013, speaking in Latin in front of the surprised cardinals, he introduced into the Catholic Church the new institution of Pope Emeritus, stating that his strength was no longer sufficient to exercise the Petrine ministry. Now, again, we read the Declaratio. Now, he doesn't technically use the word. He doesn't use the word at all, Pope Emeritus, in his resignation letter, the Declaratio, his instrument of resignation that he read out in front of a consistory of cardinals on February 11th. So, so technically, he didn't use the word, but what he did do is say that he's resigning the ministry of the Bishop of Rome in such a way that the See of Rome, See of Peter, is vacant, as we noted before. That there be a new conclave would be necessary. He thanked the cardinals, said goodbye to them, and that he invoked the name of the Lord and asked Mary to pray for the cardinals as they move forward the next conclave to elect a new supreme pontiff. And then he goes on with regarding to himself, he's going to devote his life to prayer. So here, I mean, if I guess implicitly, it looks like what Ganswein is saying, that in introducing the new institution of Pope Emeritus is that Benedict, by devoting his life to prayer, is a new approach to thinking about former popes. And I talked about that in part 1 of this video series. So I refer you back to there as to why doing that is entirely different from what other popes had done before who had retired. We had the example of Pope Celestine V, who had been a hermit, was pope for 4 or 5 months, decided, hey, this job's not for me. I want to be a hermit again, and he resigned. So what he wanted to do was just kind of go back and lead his hermit life. Where he ended up ended up being thrown into the dungeon by Boniface VIII, his successor. But that aside, that's what Celestine V wanted to do. He wanted to be a hermit again, kind of lead this reclusive private life to himself. Whereas Benedict had stated that he wanted, in both the Declaratio, that he wanted to devote his life to prayer, and then we saw in the last audience he talked about how Benedict has this kind of felt this spiritual link with his brothers and sisters, his sons and daughters in the church, that even though he's leaving the papacy, resigning doesn't revoke his love, and because of that love, he's going to devote his life in service to the church, praying for us, the church. So that's the idea. So that's kind of Benedict's idea of what a Pope Emeritus should be. So that's what we're talking about here. So he says, so again, so Benedict introduced into the Catholic Church the new institution of Pope Emeritus, stating that his strength was no longer sufficient to exercise the Petrine ministry. All true. And then this is key here. Ganswein says the key word in that statement is munus Petrinum, translated as happens most of the time with Petrine ministry. And the munus Petrinum in Benedict's statement in the Declaratio is referring to exercise, and the Benepapists have to admit this, is that their munus is being used in the sense of the word office, of officium, because that's what the Pope, that's the office the Pope holds, the Petrine office, the munus Petrinum, and so that is how the key word, that's what munus means, Petrine office, or munus Petrinum means Petrine office, in the sense that Benedict used it in the Declaratio, which is what he just said, that the key word in that statement from the Declaratio is munus Petrinum, and which means Petrine office, and then Ganswein says that's usually translated most of the time with Petrine ministry, and that's the case. And now he's German, but I haven't seen the German translation of the Declaratio, but we know in the English, munus Petrinum, I think, was put in there, was translated as Petrine ministry. In fact, some of the Benepapists claim there was some sort of dastardly plot to use to put that word in there instead of Petrine office. So all that aside, but the point is, he's saying that the word used by Benedict, munus Petrinum, earlier in his text in the Decoratio is usually translated as Petrae Munus, but we know the sense in the Decoratio, Munus is office. We know that. And yet, this is key, Ganswein says, and yet, Munus in Latin has a multiplicity of meanings. Mouse is stuck. And yet, Munus in Latin has a multiplicity of meanings. It can mean serve, duty, guide, gift, or even prodigy. So why is Ganswein telling us it means something else? Right? We know what it meant in the Decoratio. It meant in reference to the resignation. He was talking about the Petrine office, Munus as office. But here, Ganswein's now saying, yes, it does mean office, but it means all these other things too. So right away, right here, we're seeing Ganswein is broadening the meaning beyond office. He's not talking about the meaning of Munus as office now. He's talking about the meaning of office broadly. It means serve, duty, guide, gift, or even prodigy. So in that sense, serve, that's also, oddly enough, that's also synonymous with the Latin word ministerium, because ministerium and munus are synonyms. Both those words in Latin, munus, ministerium, include the meanings of serve, duty, office. So we know they're synonyms. But it's curious here. So ministerium can also mean office, as it does in the Decoratio. But it's curious here that Ganswein is saying, yeah, it means this thing in the Decoratio, but it has a multiplicity of meanings. It can also mean serve, duty, guide, gift, or prodigy. So he's talking about it has other meanings which don't directly mean the Petrine office. So that's key, because then he goes on here to say, before and after his resignation, Benedict understood and understands his task as participation in such a Petrine ministry. What's such Petrine ministry? He's talking about, in a broader sense, his participation in a broader sense of the Petrine ministry, not in the sense of the office, but in the sense of maybe serving and maybe having a moral duty. And we saw in the last audience, Benedict had talked about having that he's not returning to a private life. He's going to serve the church. Clearly, he feels this sense of responsibility to pray for those who he belongs to and who belongs to him. So that's what he's talking about. That's the broad, loose sense of maintaining or participating in the Petrine ministry, not in the literal sense of being a pope still, but in a broader sense, a Petrine ministry. And look at it this way: is that a pope's ministry it embraces the whole church. So it's Petrine. Now, that Benedict is in a unique situation that none of us are. Now, we might each pray for the church, but we do so as a layman or a priest or a sister, a nun, a bishop, or whomever. But only Benedict and Francis, at the time when they both were there together living, were both alive, they both were the only ones on the face of the planet living who had at that time a unique relationship with the rest of the church. So even though Benedict had resigned, his view was still Petrine-like, is that it embraced the whole church, that he was praying for the whole church. So his personal mission of continuing to pray, have a life of prayer after his resignation, was kind of Petrine-like, if you want to say it like that. So here he has kind of in scare quotes, Petrine ministry. So again, so what we see here is Ganswein starts off talking about the meaning, talks about munus Petrinum as used in the Decoratio, which refers to Petrine office. But then he goes on to say, but yet it means these other things. And it's with regard to these other things, that's the kind of sense in which Benedict, before and after his resignation, understands as a participation, meaning he's still, in court, his service is still to the whole church. He's serving a life of prayer, not as a pope, but as a ex-pope, as a former pope. So that's what's going on here at the outset of this section. Okay, I just want to, again, really drive home this point. So imagine, as you read through this, Ganswein talks about how Benedict introduced the Pope Emeritus, and we already addressed that here a few moments ago, and earlier in part one of this two-part series. But he talks about how he introduced this when he stated that his strength was no longer sufficient to exercise the Petrine ministry. And in fact, he literally said that in his declaratio, his statement of resignation. And note here, and this is key, as Ganswein is trying to make a special point here. He's saying the key word in that statement, in this declaratio, is munus Petrinum. Munus Petrinum is what that in Latin, when it refers to the papacy, means the Petrine office. One of the meanings of munus is office. That's one of the meanings. And that's the meaning clearly was meant and intended in the declaratio, because that's what he was resigning. Excuse me. But then, all of a sudden, Ganswein shifts gears on us. He says it's usually translated with Petrine ministry, say into the English. Well, he's German, but in the English translations on the Vatican website of the Declaratio, the word Petrine ministry is used in place of Petrine office or Petrine munus, and that's one of the Benepapists kind of think. Some of them have kind of alleged that there was some sort of conspiracy in changing the definitions or the meanings of the words. But anyway, so we know munus Petrinum in the Declaratio means Petrine office. Office is one of the meanings of munus, but now Ganswein shifts gears on us. He says, and yet munus, the word munus in Latin, has a multiplicity of meanings. It means other things. What else? It can mean serve, duty, guide, gift, or even prodigy. So all of a sudden, Ganswein, originally talking about a word that has a very technical, theological, specific sense, talking about the papacy, but now he's saying, but the word munus has all these other meanings. So he's extending. He's extending our idea of what munus means here. He's not restricting it to the papacy, or he doesn't even mention munus. And that's odd here. He doesn't even mention office as one of the meanings of munus, which it clearly is, but he excludes that from the multiplicity of meanings. Why is he excluding it from the multiplicity of meanings? Because that's not what he's talking about. He wants to draw on these ideas, these kind of like the other senses of the word munus. He leaves out the meaning of munus as office, officium. He leaves that out. So he's saying, hey, these are some other meanings of the word munus. That's what I'm talking about now. Kind of a broader sense of the word munus, not a technical, literal sense of office. And in terms of the Petrine office, I'm talking about kind of in a loose, extended sense, and that's what he wants to talk about. And then he goes on to say, before and after his resignation, Benedict understood and understands, while he's still alive, understands his task as participation in such a Petrine ministry, participation in this broader sense. In what sense is that? Well, let's think of what Benedict said in the Declaratio after we read where he said he resigned. And I talked about how he said kind of goodbye to the cardinals. Let's pray to the Lord. Ask Mary to pray and guide the cardinals in the conclave. As for me, I'm going to go lead a life devoted to prayer. That's what he's going to do. So that's a service. He's going to serve in prayer. And he talked about that in the last audience. He talked about in the last audience, as I just showed you a few slides ago, where he talked about becoming Pope and having uh, this sense of a belonging and love, this bond of charity for the individuals who comprise the church. And even though he's resigning, he retains that bond of charity towards everyone. And because of that, he's going to serve the church through prayer. And what's one of the definitions here of munus is serve and duty. Benedict clearly felt that he had a moral duty. He was going to continue to serve the church, not as Pope, but as a former Pope. And that's what he's talking about. That's the kind of participation in the Petrine ministry in a loose sense, not the specific sense of office, but in this loose sense of serving. But why is this? Why would he say Petrine ministry? Well, poetically, you can certainly say that if certainly there's only two men at the time when Benedict was alive. There were only two men who had a Petrine view of the world because they either held the office or had formerly held the office. Uh, in Benedict's case, he had once been Pope, but he still retained this love for the church, his sons and daughters. Only two men on Earth, on the planet at that time, could uniquely say that about this, having this unique relationship with other individuals in the church. Even though if I pray for the church or you pray for the church, you never had the same relationship, that particular type of bond of charity that Benedict had with the church. And he had it as Pope, and he had it after he was Pope. And that's why Ganswein says here, before and after his resignation, Benedict understood and understands his participation in that type of Petrine ministry, meaning praying for the whole church. So I think that's pretty clear what's going on here. Would the world have been better off if Ganswein didn't give this speech? Probably, just because of all the confusion that came after it. But two things. I think it's clear just from this that he clearly broadened the meaning. Why did he do that? Because he wasn't talking about he excluded a meaning. He excluded the word office. It doesn't show up here. He doesn't say that's one of the meanings, multiplicity of meanings, even though it is. He didn't list it because he's excluding it. He brought in other words because he wants to broaden the idea of what Benedict is doing. He's no longer in the office, but he's still going to serve. And that's what Benedict said. He's going to serve the church. He said in the Declaratio. It's clear from the last audience. I just explained that. And I think I'll give a couple other examples that demonstrate that is what he meant. Because I'll give two more examples from the text of the Ganswein speech to show we do have reason to believe that he had this kind of broader idea of ministry, Petrine ministry, that it wasn't in a literal sense that he participated in the Petrine ministry as a pope or any part of being a pope. And let's go on here, and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so again, keep in mind we have Ganswein, who first draws our attention to the use of munus petrinum in the Declaratio. There, munus has a meaning of office, which is one of the meanings of munus. It is one of the many meanings of munus. So that's one of the meanings of it. But then Ganswein switches gears and wants us to think of other things. He says, and yet munus in Latin has a multiplicity of meanings. And here in his list of the multiplicity, he doesn't mention office as being one of the multiplicity. He excludes it. Why? Because that's not what he's drawing our attention to. He's drawing our attention to other words. It can mean serve, it can mean duty, guide, gift, or even prodigy. That's what he wants our attention on. The office of the papacy is, at least here, from this would be munus petrinum, but he says, no, we're not using munus in that sense. We're looking at these multiplicity of meanings. We're looking at this broader sense excluding the sense of office, because Benedict's not in the office. And we just discussed that before and after his resignation, Benedict understood and understands his participation in such a Petrine ministry, that broader sense of munus is what he understood. That he understood and understands his task as participation in such a Petrine ministry. So even before his resignation and after, he understood this broader sense. Now, certainly that broad sense would have also included office when he was Pope, but Ganswein is excluding the meaning of the word office. So just as Benedict has this sense of serving, and he talks about how he's going to continue to serve the church in prayer. He said that in his Declaratio. He said it in his last audience. He's going to serve in prayer, but he's not going to serve. The word office is excluded because he's not Pope anymore. So it continues. So Ganswein goes on to say that he says he has left the papal throne. So again, he's not talking about Benedict still being Pope. He's left the papal throne. Ganswein says it right. Ganswein says it right there. And in fact, he later on in this same section, he says, since the election of his successor Francis on March 13, 2013, there are not therefore two popes. There's only one pope. That's Francis. In the view of Ganswein, in the view of Benedict. So Ganswein saying up front, yeah, we're not talking about two popes. So he's just talking about Benedict sharing in this ministry in a broad sense of the Petrine ministry in a broad sense, not in a literal sense. That his viewpoint is, Benedict's viewpoint is, I'm still praying for the whole church, which is a Petrine attitude to have, and only two men in a real sense ever even had that at that time, ever had that outlook, who could say that, who either had that relationship with the church. And in Benedict's case, he's still praying for the church. He belonged to people, and they to him as Pope. He's no longer Pope, but they still belong to him. So that's kind of he still has this Petrine view of them, not in any kind of official sense, but he still has this felt responsibility to pray for the church, to pray for them and his sons and daughters. That's really what's talking about. And then we can see as he goes on, he says he has not at all abandoned this ministry. Well, Benedict said that in his last audience. He said, "I'm not abandoning the cross. I'm remaining at the side of the Lord in a new way." Well, what's a new way? Not as Pope. He was Pope. Now he's in a new way, not Pope. And that's why Ganswein goes on here to say, and I think this underlines the fact that he's speaking of Benedict's participation in this Petrine ministry still in a broad sense, in a loose sense, in a figurative sense. Ganswein says Benedict has complemented the personal office with a collegial and synodal dimension as a quasi-shared ministry. Well, it says it right there. So he's saying Benedict is complementing the personal office. Well, the personal office is being held by Francis at this time. So Francis holds the personal office of the papacy, and then what Benedict is doing in maintaining, continuing to pray for the church, for all the sons and daughters out there. He's adding, so to speak, a collegial synodal dimension that they both had. Benedict and Francis at that time, when Benedict was still alive, still had this kind of Francis had literally this responsibility for the whole church. Benedict had this felt responsibility as a former pope to continue. But so in that sense, they're kind of sharing, in a figurative sense, sharing the ministry. That's the sense that Ganswein is talking about. And indeed, he says right here, he complimented the personal office with a collegial and synodal dimension as a quasi-shared ministry. Quasi-shared is key, because quasi means, look it up, it means apparently but not really, so to speak or so to say. So again, he's speaking in a figurative sense, a loose sense. He's not talking about a literal sense that they literally, truly share the same office, that they're some ways both still popes. No, in an apparent way, but not a real sense. Benedict still had this outlook of having a Petrine love, which he continued with him. This bond of charity that he's going to extend it to the whole church, which he had as Pope, and continue to pray for the church. That's what we're talking about here. So, and I think we can see as we go on here, and also too, that also we saw that with the word quasi-shared, because quasi means apparently but not really. So he's not really a shared ministry. It's kind of looks like one, but it's really not. But also further on down here, when he said, I already highlighted part of this down here, is since the election of successor Francis on March 13th, there are not therefore two popes, but a de facto and expanded ministry. Well, de facto is not de jure. De jure is in law, so he's talking about de facto. So it's not an expanded ministry that is an office that is truly shared in any kind of legal sense or anything like that. It's just de facto. It's just he's alongside the Pope praying for the whole church. It's a quasi-shared ministry. That's all Ganswein saying. He says, but a de facto, an expanded ministry with an active member and a contemplative member. Active member being Francis as the true Pope, of this quasi-shared, this apparently but not really shared ministry with Francis being the Pope, and Benedict, the one having kind of a Petrine outlook with his bond of charity, still praying for the church, the whole church, and since the two men have this kind of unique relationship with the church, one as an active pope and one as a former pope, the only two men on the planet could ever have had that kind of bond of charity with the church. That Francis as the real pope, Benedict as the former pope, serving along, not serving, but alongside, so to speak, in a quasi-shared way, praying for the church as a contemplative member. That's all that means there. So, but what other evidence do we have that, again, that we can point to say that Ganswein is trying to use this extended sense of participation of the Petrine ministry? Well, he goes on up here, returning now up earlier, he says he has complimented the personal office with collegial synodal dimension as a quasi-shared ministry, as though by this he wanted to reiterate, Benedict, as though he wanted to reiterate once again the invitation contained in the motto that the then Joseph Ratzinger took as Archbishop of Munich in Freising, in which he then naturally maintained as Bishop of Rome, meaning he contained his motto from his coat of arms. And that motto was, in Latin, Cooperatores Veritatis, which means fellow workers in the truth. And here, let me go on a few things to say about that. I want to show you the coat of arms. Okay, and I just want to show you, this is Benedict's coat of arms that he took with him when he became Pope. This is what Ganswein just referred to. And here's the motto down here, Cooperatores Veritatis. And why is this important? Well, Ganswein spoke of Benedict's coat of arms and its inclusion of a phrase, Cooperatores Veritatis, which comes from a letter from the Apostle John. That's from 3 John 1:8. Ganswein made this reference immediately following and in the context of explaining his use of the term quasi-shared ministry, in the sense of talking about the expanded Petrine ministry. What is apparent in St. John's expression, fellow workers in the truth, is that he is speaking of a shared ministry of a sort. But one can share a ministry or be fellow workers of the truth without sharing the same office in any real sense. For example, a layman in a parish, he could be a co-worker with his priest, who's pastor, who has kind of like the true authority to be the pastor of the church. He can kind of be a co-worker with him in that ministry. Ditto layman or priest with a bishop. Ditto for a layman, priest, bishop to do so with the Pope, while not even holding any of these offices. The Apostle John's letter, where he mentions the fellow workers in the truth, or co-workers of the truth, he wrote to Gaius. Gaius, I believe he may have been a bishop or leader of the local church, but the point is he was not an apostle. But yet, John called him a co-worker. Well, clearly Gaius was not an apostle, so he's using kind of in an extended sense, saying, "Hey, we're kind of working towards the same end. We're co-workers. We're kind of sharing a ministry." And that's kind of the sense that we're looking at with Francis and Benedict in terms of Ganswein's thought and what Ganswein's saying. Actually, Benedict didn't use those terms, being a co-worker or being a sharing a ministry with Francis. That's all introduced by Ganswein, but this is Ganswein trying to build up the meaning of Benedict's life post-resignation. But it's still true in this kind of broad, extended sense. Benedict is praying for the whole church. Francis is the Pope of the whole church. And so, in that kind of sense, they kind of share a ministry. Benedict is a co-worker of the truth towards the church, a co-worker in the ministry of caring for the church, in the sense that he's praying for the church, even though he's not Pope. And then I just said that St. Paul also kind of makes even stronger references to co-workers. He even references in I think it's 2 Corinthians 3:9 and 6:1. He talks about being God's fellow workers, being fellow workers with God. So we're talking about people being fellow workers with God. Well, people are not God, but they're sharing kind of in the ministry of spreading the truth of God and in that mission of spreading the gospel. So in this kind of looser sense, they're sharing, but they are not what the other person they're sharing with. They're not that person by office. Obviously not in the case of God, but we're seeing in the case of Benedict, he's not Pope anymore, but he kind of has this outlook of serving the church through prayer, the whole church. So in a sense, it's kind of a Petrine type of viewpoint in that it encompasses the church, but he's not Pope. I think that's the point to be made here. Okay, and hey, I just before we're almost finished with this section, but I just want to reiterate that again, that despite all this talk, you have Ganswein here, who's stating that Benedict left the papal throne. He talks about that no matter what he says there are not therefore two popes. There's not two popes. There's not 1.5 popes. Benedict is gone. He's not Pope anymore. I mean, I don't know how it could be any clearer, but certainly when you look at things that Benedict said, such as to the pilgrims of Albano, I will no longer be the supreme pontiff of the Catholic Church. You kind of put it all together and read Benedict through Benedict, and not read Benedict through Ganswein. I mean, it's clear that he's not Pope, but like I said, I don't think there's any contradiction between Ganswein and Benedict. This is Ganswein's just here explaining it in his words, when he's using words that Benedict didn't use, such as saying it's a shared ministry and so forth, but even taking what appear on first glance to be kind of eyebrow raisers, is that when you understand what Benedict actually said, and actually the actual text of what Ganswein's saying, it's not far out. He's again speaking of ministry in a kind of a shared Petrine ministry in this extended sense, this broad sense. Like I said, he excluded the word office. There are not two popes. He's left the papal throne. So therefore, Francis is the true pope. That's what Ganswein is saying here. But what Benedict is doing as a former pope is that he continues to pray for the church, as he said in his final audience and in the Decoratio. And in this sense, since his prayer, as he said, is for the whole church, and he had this bond of charity with the whole church as individuals, in that kind of loose sense, he had a Petrine outlook, meaning towards the whole church. Even though he's not pope, he still has this love for the church in this kind of former relationship, or relationship through a bond of charity with the church and individuals in the church that no one else but a pope or a former pope can say they ever had. Like I said, I could pray for the whole church, but I never had that kind of spiritual authority as pope, obviously. And so, and that relationship with the body of the church, so that's unique to Benedict. It's unique to Francis. In that sense, they kind of share something, whether as pope or a former pope, is that kind of Petrine outlook. And that's all this kind of sense, I think, that's coming through with Ganswein. And I showed, I think, by looking at the coat of arms, the motto on it, Benedict's coat of arms, about being co-workers in the truth, is that same sense. And that's what Ganswein's talking about, that he's bringing that motto, being a co-worker. But again, he's talking about a quasi-shared, almost shared ministry, apparently, but not really. Now, okay, so like I said, I would give two examples to show why Ganswein's discussion about the definition of munus earlier in this paragraph actually supports my argument, and I'll get to that right now. And again, that part, like I said, returning to the passage, this part of the passage, as I said I would, as I argued earlier, it's clear that Ganswein is not intending to mean munus petrinum in a univocal sense with the papacy. He is speaking in a loose sense, figurative sense, if we can use that word, or metaphorical sense, an extended sense. Like I said, when he gave the definition of munus in its multiplicity of meanings, he excluded the meaning of office from that list. So again, he's not talking about office. He's talking in a very broad sense. And how else? I said I give you two proofs of that. Well, actually, it's three. One, this is proof in itself, just by looking at the text of what he says here, that he's excluding, he doesn't include the word office in its multiplicity of meanings. So that's one proof. Second proof is looking at the motto on the coat of arms, co-workers of truth. He's using the term very broadly. You be a co-worker in a ministry, your parish priest ministry, without being the priest, without being pastor. So that's the second proof. But the third proof I'm going to show you right now. We're going to look at the conclusion of the speech, where it becomes abundantly clear that Ganswein is speaking in this very broad, extended sense, and is not meaning that Benedict is still pope. So let's see that now. Okay, so we're getting near the end of this video. As I said, that the argument, the case I'm making and have made from the text, is that Ganswein is not intending to use Petrine ministry or Petrine munus in a univocal sense with the papacy in any sense, in terms of being the papal office. So he's not saying, as I argued, that Benedict still participates in the office itself. Benedict only, in some broad, extended sense, as a former pope, he kind of was like a co-worker in the truth, so to speak, through his efforts to pray for the church, but only in that sense, not in any kind of sense where he's pope in any way. How else can we know that? Well, how else can we know that Benedict is speaking in this looser? That Ganswein is speaking in this looser sense when he's talking about the Munus Petrinum. Well, we look at the conclusion of his speech. Recall that his speech was, the context of the speech was a book presentation for Father Roberto Regali's book about the pontificate, Benedict's pontificate. Right? That's the context of the speech. Also present at the same speech, I think, were Peter Seewald, I believe, but he's certainly mentioned here. So that's the context. So he's talking about Regali's book. So let's go to the conclusion now. This is Ganswein talking near the end of his speech. Thus, this book, which again he gave a nice talk about the pontificate and the resignation of Benedict. Ganswein says, thus this book once again throws a consoling gaze on the peaceful imperturbability and serenity of Benedict XVI at the helm of the bark of Peter in the dramatic years 2005 through 2013. And this is key here, pay attention. At the same time, however, through this illuminating account, Regali himself now also takes part in the Munus Petri, of which I spoke. So he's saying the writer now also participates in the Munus Petri. Those are the terms used by Ganswein earlier. Like I said, he gave a very broad definition, and so he's saying Regali is participating in the Petrine Munus in this very broad sense, not in a technical theological sense that he is somehow shares being pope. That's not what Ganswein's saying, and so he says here, Ganswein himself now also takes part in the Munus Petri, of which I spoke. So that means Regali isn't really pope, and therefore his use of Benedict's participation in that same ministry earlier in the speech also wasn't meant to be taken in a literal, technical, theological sense. It's meant to be broadly meant in a very loose sense. So he says that Regali himself now also takes part in the Munus Petri, of which I spoke. Like Peter Seewald, who has written a lot of who has done a lot of interviews with Benedict. So like Peter Seewald and others before him, Roberto Regali, as a priest, professor, and a scholar, also enters into that enlarged Petrine ministry around the successors of the Apostle Peter. So again, just by writing about the papacy, he enters into that enlarged Petrine ministry because he's doing a service for the church by writing about the Petrine ministry, about the popes, writing about his book about Benedict, or Seewald's interviews with Benedict when he was pope or resigned pope. But the point is that Seewald and Regali are entering this enlarged Petrine ministry in a kind of a loose sense, not any real sense is in that they're a pope or a mini pope or partially pope or anything. It's all kind of a figurative way of speech, befitting towards the context of this speech, which I talked about in part 1 of this series. I think that seems pretty evident here. Clearly, Ganswein, like I said, he talked about multiplicity of meetings. When he gave those multiplicity of meetings, he talked about serve and duty, gift and prodigy. He excluded the word office from that multiplicity, because to have done so would have been to talk about the papacy itself. He excluded that, and that's what he was referring to, this looser sense of serving the church. And then he brought in Benedict into that kind of participation, and now he's talking about Regali, the priest whose book is the subject of the speech, because he wrote about a pontificate, wrote about the papacy. He kind of enters into to the Petrine service too, the Petrine ministry through that effort. Same with Seewald, who had interviewed popes in the past, such as Benedict when he was pope, and also many other interviews after he resigned, who had entered into this enlarged Petrine ministry. So they're not talking about a real shared papacy between Benedict and Francis, Regali, Seewald, and so many others. That's not the case. So anyway, I think I've demonstrated the point. Okay, so again, the summary of the objection is Ganswein spoke of an expanded Petrine ministry or a quasi-shared ministry, a synodal dimension, a collegial dimension, and so forth. And the Benepapists claim this can only mean Benedict believed he was still pope in some way, and that Ganswein was communicating that to us in his speech. However, I asked the question, did Ganswein really mean these things in a strict theological, technical sense, meaning Benedict was still pope in some real way, or did Ganswein mean this in a looser, extended, or more figurative sense? I've suggested that the latter sense is clearly suggested by the text. I believe I've met the burden in showing that. I put the text before you, the viewer, the reader, and have shown why there is excellent reasons to believe that the interpretation that I'm putting forward is the correct one. So let's continue here. So how we suggested that, how have I demonstrated that the sense I am suggesting is the proper sense, the more probable sense to view Ganswein's speech? Well, first of all, Ganswein in his speech speaks of Benedict having given up the Petrine office. He says he resigned. This is all from the speech. He said he resigned. I showed you where he said Benedict left the papal throne. I also showed you some text from the conclusion of the speech where he says that the pontificate went from 2005 to 2013. So that is obviously his implication is that his pontificate ended in 2013. Elsewhere in the speech, I didn't show the clip here, but you can find the text itself where Ganswein talks about that Benedict no longer wears the fisherman's ring, that Ganswein had seen him take it off. And the fisherman's ring is one of the two Sibylla Pope receives at the Mass that commemorates him ascending the chair of St. Peter. The ring is one of the things he receives. I think the other is the pallium. Ganswein has also said there is only one pope. He said there are not two popes, and obviously because he said Benedict left the chair of Peter, left the throne of Peter, that's not Benedict, it's Francis. And indeed, in fact, Ganswein in his text of his speech says Francis is Benedict's successor. I mean, these things might seem obvious from reading it, but I mean, you have to state these things that, again, you have Ganswein affirming in his speech these many ways of saying Benedict is no longer pope. And you have to keep that in mind. If you're going to interpret this thing, is how do you harmonize all these things? You just can't throw them out the window, or you need some reason within the text to say all these things should be understood in a qualified sense. So let's continue on here. Okay, and then it's clear, I demonstrated, I showed you, I highlighted for you in great detail where Ganswein alludes to this broader definition, broader multiplicity of meanings of munus. And when he did that, when he listed the multiplicity of meanings, he left out the primary and theological sense of the key word if you're talking about the papacy. He left out office. That's one of the meanings of munus. He left it out. He talked about it, the munus petrinum, when he referred to back to the decoratio, because that was the instrument of resignation. But Ganswein said, but hey, this word munus has other meanings. So he's excluding office, the one that really applies to the papacy, when you're talking about the papacy as an office, and then he talks about this multiplicity of meanings, and office is not one of the multiplicities he wanted to talk about. That's why he excluded it. He wanted to draw our attention to this multiplicity of meanings, which is kind of a broader sense, a different sense, a figurative sense of how Benedict could participate. Moreover, Ganswein, he speaks of only a quasi-shared ministry. Quasi means apparently, but not really. Look it up, dictionary. Quasi, apparently, but not really. Even if you plug in quasi into a German to English translation, it's essentially the same thing. So to say, so to speak. So when you say something like that, well, we're speaking in a loose sense, not in a strict technical sense. So we're not really talking about a truly shared ministry, like, hey, this is mine and yours, we're sharing this together. No, we're meaning in different ways, like co-workers of the truth. And the example that's on the motto of Benedict's coat of arms. Yeah, and like I just said, that kind of skipped a little bit ahead there. But again, Ganswein references Benedict's coat of arms, 3 John 6:8. I forget if it was 6:8 or 1:8. But where St. John, the apostle, refers to Gaius, who appears to be some sort of leader in the church there that he's writing to. He calls him a fellow worker in the truth, even though Gaius is not an apostle. Even if he's a bishop, he's not an apostle. He is not an apostle. So they're kind of fellow workers in a ministry, right? They're sharing a ministry, but Gaius is not sharing the apostleship of John, and that's the point of Ganswein to mention that. That's why he mentions it in his speech, is to just say that in this kind of extended sense, Benedict is kind of participating still in the Petrine ministry because he's praying for the whole church. That's all that's being said there. Okay, and then we saw in concluding his speech, Ganswein speaks of others participating in an expanded ministry, expanded Petrine ministry. But obviously, he cannot mean that these individuals were popes too, or popes in any sense at all. Ditto, obviously, for Benedict, because clearly Ganswein is speaking in a loose sense, not in a technical sense. That we should come away thinking that Regali and Seewald are popes as well, right? Because if you recall, it was just a couple slides ago that Ganswein said, "Thus this book once again throws a consoling gaze on the peaceful imperturbability and serenity of Benedict XVI at the helm of the bark of Peter in the dramatic years 2005 to 2013. At the same time, however, through this illuminating account, through his effort about writing about the papacy of Benedict, Regali, the author, himself now also takes part in the Munus Petri, of which he spoke earlier when he was talking about the multiplicity of meanings, kind of this broader, looser sense of participation. Like Peter Seewald, who also had interviewed popes in the past, and also Benedict when Pope was a pope and when he was resigned pope. Like Peter Seewald and others before him, Roberto Regali, as priest, professor, scholar, also thus enters into an enlarged Petrine ministry around the successors of the apostle Peter. So by his work, his efforts of writing and explicating and expounding upon the papacy of Benedict, or Seewald was just mentioned, through his efforts of interviewing Benedict when he was pope, that these two authors and writers have themselves, because they're kind of pushing forward the ministry of Peter in a way, they participate in it. They share in this enlarged. They're now part of this enlarged Petrine ministry. Ganswein's not saying that, hey, Francis, Benedict, Seawald, and you were going, hey, come on in. You're now a pope too. You're now part of this real, truly shared ministry where we each have a part and all that. No, he's speaking in a loose sense, like co-workers. You support the papacy through your writings. That in this kind of an extended way, you're sharing in the ministry of Peter. And you could probably say this about the nuns who are maybe caretakers, for Benedict when he was pope, who worked for him and cared for him and made his bed, cleaned his clothes, fed him. In a very loose sense, they were kind of supporting co-workers with Peter, right? You can kind of say they kind of shared in the ministry of Peter. So you can use that they shared in the Petrine ministry in that loose sense. And so Benedict, in a similar type of way of thinking of things, that's how Benedict participated in the expanded Petrine ministry. And then finally, conclude my reply on even years later, I think Ganswein got burned by what he said. I mean, he, as I indicated in part one, that I do think some of his terms and analogies that he'd use in his speech of Benedict, such as using John Duns Scotus's words about the Immaculate Conception, about God's decision, and kind of applying that to Benedict's decision to resign and then take on the title of Pope Emeritus. That's kind of over the top, and so I think he got kind of burned about that. So I think he kind of wants to put this speech behind him, but still, in an interview with Diane Montagna, I think the article was, "Did Benedict really resign?" Ganswein, Burke, and I think Brandmuller weigh in. You can find that article on LifeSite News. But in that article with Diane Montagna, Ganswein again he doesn't want to talk about this much anymore because he got burned, and he probably figures the less said the better at this point. He just reaffirmed that there's one legitimately elected and incumbent pope, and that is Francis. And that should put this all to bed, that whatever he said is consistent with that statement. And I believe I've successfully outlined that is the case. So. Okay, so let's just summarize a few key points here at the end. First, I would just say that a plain reading of the speech in context supports the view Benedict XVI truly resigned. That harkens back to objection number one, if you recall. If you've stayed with me through these two videos, God bless you. But if you look at objection one, which was from Anne Barnhart, she had alleged that you have to be fundamentally dishonest. You have to lie if you don't think the plain meaning is essentially what she says it is, which is the Benepapist interpretation. But I believe I put the text in front of you, the key parts that are the most disputed, to show why the reading that the interpretation that I was suggesting is certainly the more probable one, if I think it is in fact the true one, or close enough to the true one that Ganswein intended, which was just this kind of loose sense of talking about Petrine ministry or expanded ministry. I did that without imposing any presuppositions upon the text. I did look at Benedict's words, but we should read Benedict through Benedict. But Ganswein's subject is Benedict and what Benedict did with his resignation. And what I offered a way of harmonizing the two, his Declaratio and Last Audience, with what Ganswein was saying. And I think that was fairly presented. And I think that the interpretation that I put forward is found, it comes forth from the text itself. And how do we know that? I said Ganswein, first of all, made several references to the end of Benedict's pontificate. So he's speaking of a pope who's out of office. Most significantly, he said that he left the throne of Peter. He put a time frame around his pontificate. He never says he partially resigned. He doesn't say those. All his things are about things about leaving the office, leaving the throne, giving up, surrendering his fisherman's ring, all these things. It's only by forcing these references to mean something less against their plain meaning or ignoring them entirely can the Benepapists interpret Ganswein as they do. So I'd kind of flip around the accusation that Barnhard made. Now, I'm not going to accuse her of dishonesty or lying. I just think she's wrong. That's all I got to say. She's wrong. You have to read it, and that goes for every other Benepapist who reads these texts and who write and or put together videos on them. They have to come to the text thinking about partial resignations and things like that, and say, aha, this. But saying he left the papal throne, that doesn't sound like a partial resignation, does it? He was Pope from 2005 to 2013. That doesn't sound like it. He gave up his fisherman's ring. That doesn't sound like it. Then I showed how the last audience fits into this, the Declaratio. So it's only again by bringing in suppositions can you hope to point the text somewhere else. And in fact, you might, when you look at Benepapist websites, when they do present Benedict's words from the last audience or from the Declaratio or Ganswein's speech, look and see. You'll see that they try to turn the reader. I'm not trying to read any evil motives into it, but it shows they're reading into it. You'll see they'll give a phrase and they'll put in brackets, well, this means this. Well, does it? Does it? And I think I've shown it doesn't mean that. They'll always put that. Well, active exercise of the ministry, by this he means this, So it's just clearly, if they had the plain meaning, they wouldn't have to be doing stuff like that. I didn't do any of that. I walked you through, I talked you through my meanings. There were no inserted brackets about, hey, this is what this means. That's you kind of put that thought in your head. So check it out. If you're a Benepapist and you follow someone like Ann Barnhart, Mark Doherty, Ed Mazza, or Dr. Mazza, look at their books or their blogs. You'll see a lot of bracketed commentary that tell you what that means. So it's not evident. It's not plain. So they're kind of doing what they allege others, and I don't mean to suggest they're being dishonest. Only that they're getting the interpretation wrong. Now, while portions of Ganswein's rhetoric may seem strange, especially in light of suspicions regarding the current pontificate of Francis, in the context of the event, Ganswein's friendship with Benedict XVI, etc., such rhetoric that he had in his speech is understandable and consistent with a valid resignation. Now, there I'm talking about, I think it was reply to objection number 2 in the part 1 of this video, where referencing how Ganswein talks about this was an incredible step, or no step like this, or things like that, where he's kind of this over top superlatives and kind of hyperbolic phraseology, referencing Don Scotus and his reference to the Immaculate Conception and so forth. In context, when you go back to my first part 1 of this video series, and see, I think it's my reply to objection 2, where I talk about what's going on, his friendship and so forth with Benedict, the negative views of his resignation, and Ganswein. I think I kind of see his effort here is in part to kind of rehabilitate Benedict and his resignation by kind of giving it some special meaning. Now, to do that, though, he really took what Benedict said about wanting to serve the church through prayer. And it is kind of unique. He was the only pope who kind of set that ministry for this mission, goal, ministry, kind of informal ministry for himself. He is the first to do that. So that's where you see, though, a lot of these superlatives entering in, because the context of the event is a retrospective on the papacy of Benedict, but not through the uh, uh, optics of Regali's book. That's what brought everyone together to talk about it. But then, obviously, naturally, Ganswein would have to talk about the resignation itself, and then say some nice words about Benedict, because he was still alive, obviously, at the time. So he wanted to say, put in some good words for him. And then we did look at references to the expanded Petrine ministry, and I think I have shown that these can be understood as consistent with a valid resignation without reading into the text. Again, I walked you through why you look at how Ganswein defined the multiplicity of meanings for the word munus, and that how he excluded office in that list of multiplicity of meanings. So obviously he was trying to broaden the meaning without including office. He was talking about serve, duty, things that are also translated as ministry from the Latin. So because munus is synonymous with ministerium in many different ways. 3 of those ways are serve, duty, office. But again, Ganswein had excluded office when he was talking about. And then up there we saw that, and then we saw how in the same discussion about a quasi-shared ministry, an almost shared ministry, apparently but not really, you have Ganswein talking about Benedict's motto from being a cardinal and how he brought, or actually when he was a bishop, and how he brought that forward to being a pope, that co-workers in the truth. And he's talking about that in this same context about an almost shared ministry. So he's talking loosely. Many people can share in the ministry of, say, their pastor or their local bishop in a loose sense. They're not the bishop. They don't have the bishop's ministry, but they work towards the same end, have the same types of goals. They're supporting him, and you can, in that sense, you share in the ministry. Like I said, even St. Paul talked about being co-workers with God. So you can be a co-worker with God, but obviously one is not God. God is God, but we can be co-workers with him, because you're working towards the end of spreading the truth and so forth. And we saw in Ganswein's speech also at the end, he makes the references to Regali and Seewald participating in an enlarged Petrine ministry. So he's using the same sort of terms of Regali and Seewald that he used of Benedict. So clearly he's not meaning it in a true kind of literal sense. He's kind of talking in an extended sense, a loose sense, a figurative sense, metaphorical sense, whichever word you want to use. He's not meaning that they are literally, that they're joining and being a pope like Francis. No, he's just saying that they're supporting the papacy in different ways. One, by writing books about the papacy or interviewing popes, writing books about the former pontificates, or in the case of Benedict, praying for the whole church. And in this way, they're supporting the ministry. And in that way, they do share in this enlarged Petrine ministry. That's all that's being said here. So again, in summary, the text of the speech is consistent with the view Benedict's resignation was valid. I think I've offered, certainly at a minimum, a plausible reading of Ganswein's speech in relation to Benedict's actual words in the Declaratio and in the last audience. It's plausible, and it has the benefit of not having to come up with a crazy theory that a pope could think that he could partially resign the papacy, or pretend that he resigned the papacy, or self-impeded himself. You don't have to come with some elaborate theory like that. The words, without bending them, within reason, without bending them at all, and certainly using our reason and looking at the actual words that Ganswein said, we can see that it's fair to say that there was some sort of extended use of these terms. But the Benepapists say, no, you have to look at it this narrow sense that he meant that. But that makes you accept this wild elaborate theory of a resigned or a partially resigned papacy or a self-impedency, things that have never happened before. And that's what we're being asked to believe. Where one is being asked to reject a plausible theory, as I've offered, plausible, I think more probable theory, at least more probable theory than theirs, in favor of a theory or a reading that would yield kind of this extreme theory of a partially resigned papacy that Benedict nowhere else ever talked about. Nowhere else. Nor of a self-impedency. You don't have to go to this extreme to understand what Ganswein said or what Benedict said. So my invitation to the viewer is, please look at this, especially if you're hardcore Benepapist. I mean, I think we all understand, I do, that there are concerns about the current papacy of Francis. I don't deny it. I've written about such things on my blog. So I don't seek to minimize those things, but a theory saying that Benedict remained Pope just is not tenable based on the facts. I mean, I wish I could say otherwise. When I first started looking into this whole theory, I was kind of hoping, hey, maybe they have, maybe Anne Barnhart, Mark Doherty have something on this. But then I actually looked at the texts themselves. I'm saying these don't say what they say. And that's what led me on the path of looking more into this whole thing. And the more I looked into the theory of Benepapism, the clearer it became. I never entertained the theory other than I hoped it was true before I started looking into it. So I actually entered into this whole mess hoping for an out from Francis. And this is not it. And I'm not saying there is an out to Francis. I'm just saying this is not it. And folks should, spend their time praying, doing good works, saying the rosary, going to mass, receiving the sacraments. But like I said, I'm open if people are out there want to submit some questions. Maybe I do a video of answering questions I receive or something like that if there's interest. So feel free to send me emails. You can find my contact information on my blog, romalacutaest.com. I think I will do, there might be maybe a couple more minor issues I might do a video on related to Benepapism. I think one is on apostolic blessings. I know that comes up a lot in some of the writings I see from some folks, emails and stuff. So I think I have responded to it in my book. I do have an article on apostolic blessings, on Benedict giving apostolic blessings on my blog. So please check those out. But I might do a video outlining what I said in the articles. So anyway. Okay, as with all videos, I have attached resources for folks. I have my book out there. Mine is the only book out there, Valid, the Resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. It's out on Amazon, but there's lots of, I think, good articles out there against Benepapism. There's lots of other fine writers here that I list: John Salsa, Ed Fieser, Father John Rickert, Ryan Grant. So you can always put this on pause and find the links and take a look at those articles. Okay, so again, if you've made it this far in this two-part series, may God bless you. May the wind be forever at your back and the sun shine in your face. Thank you for coming this far. If you've liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe. If you didn't like it, hit the thumbs down and don't subscribe. Ask you to maybe consider checking out my book on my historical fiction book. This is part one. This is book one of what will be a trilogy in the end. But book one is Pia Fidelis, The Two Kingdoms. It's set in the time of the Arian heresy. A lot of folks out there, you'll hear this a lot. I actually started this before I think Francis had come along, but people, a lot of people have likened these times to the Arian crisis. And if you want to see how it turns out, you might want to start reading my book in the trilogy. And then Then I have my book Valid, as I mentioned before, where I approach Benepapism, list their objections out in kind of an objection reply format, go through all of them. And again, for my next video, I'm not sure what it will be. I have question marks here. It might be apostolic blessings, but again, I invite folks, especially if you're Benepapist and things that you're stuck on, or you want to challenge me on or something, feel free to send me an email. My contact information is on my blog, and if I get enough of them to make a video worthwhile, then I'll certainly create one. But certainly with emails, I do always try to respond to them or comments on my blog. Anyway, thank you for watching, and thank you for your time.